Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all of our 7th graders out there, though anyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the second in this week's series. My name is Mrs. Alley, and I'm a 7th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for today's lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune into today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others, but it might be more fun if you first go back and watch our other lessons, since today we will be referring back to things we learned previously. Today we will be learning about the structure of Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Before we get started, to participate fully in today's lesson, you're going to need a few things: paper, pencil, a surface to write on, and the student packet for ELA Grade 7, Lesson 17, which can be found at www.tn.gov/education. Let's get started. Today, we will use the poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers to engage with poetry with a focus on the structure. Last time, we viewed images from Jacob Lawrence's series of paintings about the Great Migration and read an informational text about the Harlem Renaissance. We learned the Great Migration was a period of time in the mid-1910s to 1920s when many African Americans moved from the South to northern cities for better life opportunities. The Harlem Renaissance was a period that followed the Great Migration, where there was tremendous growth in art, literature, and political thought among the African American community centered in New York City. After the lesson, we considered the question, how do the ideas in Lawrence's paintings of the Great Migration connect to the beliefs in the Harlem Renaissance? To answer this question, you reviewed your notes from your note catchers about the paintings and article. First, we had to be sure we understood the central ideas in Jacob Lawrence's paintings. One central idea we brainstormed in the lesson was that African Americans migrated to northern cities to pursue their dreams of a better future where they would have more opportunities, freedom, and equality. Then we had to look over our notes to determine what the key beliefs were in the Harlem Renaissance. Important groups and people in the Harlem Renaissance believed African Americans should no longer tolerate their poor treatment and should take action to change the status quo. Now we have to put these ideas together. Notice in this example how the response directly connects the ideas in the painting to the beliefs of the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans migrated to have a better life in the North, and although some things were better, they were still not treated equally and fairly. So during the Harlem Renaissance, many leaders believed it was time for African Americans to be more vocal and politically active to change the status quo so they could finally live the dreams and ideas depicted in Lawrence's paintings. Today, our goal is to read and analyze how the structure and language of the poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers impacts the meaning of the poem. In case you didn't know, the word Negro is an old word that refers to African Americans. We will begin with me showing you what that looks like, and then there will be time for you to practice on your own with my support. Finally, I will assign you independent work that you can complete after the video ends. Let's get started. Close your eyes for a minute and picture a river that you've either visited yourself or have seen in pictures. As you do, try to hear what the river sounds like. Is the river quietly flowing, or is the river water smashing on rocks and making a sound? Now, watch the river. What does the water look like as it's flowing? Is it moving quickly or moving so slowly you can barely see the current? Next, try to picture where the river begins. Does it start as just a little creek in a little town? What about where it ends? What does that place look like? Does it finally flow into the ocean, a lake, or maybe it joins another river? Great, you can open your eyes. There is something special about a river, isn't there? It can be relaxing or scary. It can be slow and lazy or quick and exciting. No matter the river that you pictured, you're connected to it in some way. Langston Hughes was an African American writer during the Harlem Renaissance and is considered by many people to be one of America's great poets. He wrote the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. The rivers he writes about are also very special, and each one, like most rivers, has a long history. Let's talk a little bit about the rivers Langston Hughes mentions in his poem before we read the poem. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. Here's a picture of the Euphrates River. So just by looking at the picture, where would you say the river is located? Yes, I think it must run down a pretty dry area, like a desert. Look at all the sand and dirt. The Euphrates River is located in Western Asia, but more importantly, it is one of the oldest and most important rivers in history. It runs through a part of the world known as the cradle of civilization. To give you some idea of its location, here's a map. Here's a picture of the Congo. Where do you think this one is located? Good, not in the desert. In fact, I'd say it's someplace in a forest. Let's look at a map. Awesome! If you guessed a jungle instead of a forest, you were correct. In fact, the Congo runs through parts of the continent of Africa. It is the second longest river in Africa, only behind the Nile, our next river. Do you remember what the Nile runs through? Yes, it runs through Egypt. And while Egypt is known for many things, what is one of the best things that it is best known for? Awesome, the pyramids. Finally, the speaker talks about one of the most famous rivers in the United States. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I know some of you watching know about the Mississippi River because you live near it. You'll see on the map that the river actually runs through a small part of Tennessee. You can also see that it can be very pretty at times with the sunset, or it can look kind of dirty because of the mud the river is so famous for. Great job, everyone. So now that we know a little bit about the rivers that are mentioned, we will read the poem to hear what Langston Hughes has to tell us about them. To get ready, I'm going to make a note catcher so I can keep track of my thoughts, and I'd like you to make this note catcher on your paper too, to jot down your thoughts about the poem. Make sure you draw it to fill the page, like this. As usual, I'm going to read the entire poem the first time without stopping. So close your eyes again. This time I want you to just listen and think about what you notice and how you feel. Ready? The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Wow, what an awesome poem, right? Take a moment to jot down what you notice about the poem and how it made you feel. I noticed the speaker discusses how he knows different rivers throughout history, and there's several stanzas of different lengths. I also see a few lines are indented in the middle. You know what? Those indented lines make the poem look like a river going back and forth. When I read the poem, I had a positive feeling, kind of like strength or importance. Like the river. I'll have to reread the poem very closely to see if this feeling is on the right track, or if I just imagined it. I'm going to jot some notes in my note catcher. Under gist, let's put speaker knows different rivers across the world in history. And under structure, I'll jot varied stanza lengths and indented lines. Looks like a river flowing. Take a moment to record these notes on your note catcher. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. In this first stanza, there are just 3 lines. What do I notice here? Oh, look, the second line repeats the first line. I've known rivers, and then describes the rivers in more detail. I wonder what that means. Maybe the speaker repeats himself to emphasize his connection to the rivers and to human history. If that is the case, then I need to figure out what that connection is and why it is important. Let me jot this down under structure. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. This stanza is just 1 line, so it stands out as significant to the meaning of the poem. I'm not quite sure yet what it means, but I do know he is comparing his soul to the rivers. Let me jot that under language. Comparison. My soul is equal deep like the rivers. Let me continue reading a bit more. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen the muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. This is the stanza with all the rivers in them. It's also the longest stanza. We know a little about these rivers, but since this is a poem, I want to think about what each river represents. Langston Hughes names these rivers, not the many others in the world, like the Cumberland River here in Tennessee. Let's think about the structure in this stanza. What do you notice? You're right. Every line does start with I. That's another example of repetition. Okay, I'll jot that down under structure. When he writes about the Euphrates, he says it was when the dawns were. What did we learn about the Euphrates earlier? Oh yes, it is the cradle of civilization, or where human society began. He mentions building a hut in the Congo River, which I remember is in the middle of Africa. Actually, the heart of Africa. The pyramids and the Nile River were during ancient Egypt civilization thousands of years ago. With Mississippi, he talks about Abe Lincoln. So that is during the Civil War in the 1860s. Oh, that's when slavery in the United States ended. How is this stanza organized? This stanza moves from ancient times to more modern times. It's like telling a timeline of the speaker's history. I'll add this to the structure column in my notes. Do you think the speaker was there for all of these events? No, I don't think so either. So the I doesn't mean him specifically. It represents its African American ancestors, maybe? Let me add that to what I just wrote. Okay, here's what I've got in my notes. See if it matches yours. Now that I've demonstrated how to look at the poem to look for structural and language clues to meaning, it's your turn to do some more thinking. We'll continue with the third stanza and go line by line to analyze it. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. The first line says, I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. What phrases stand out? Good. Let's write that down under the language part of our note catcher. What do you think that means? Right. Dawn is the beginning of the day. So maybe Hughes is talking about the beginning of civilization. Let's add that to our note catcher. What else? Yes, there's also bathed in the Euphrates. But what does that represent? That could work. Maybe it means the river was so pure and clean since it was just at the beginning of civilization. Let's add that to our note catcher. Let's read the next line. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. What phrase have you pulled out and what do you think it means? Jot it down in your note catcher. Great thinking. The phrase lulled me to sleep makes me think of a baby. So it's like the river is the mother cradling the speaker's ancestors. What do you notice about the language in this line? I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. Yes, I noticed the phrase raised the pyramids above it too. We know the pyramids are some of the great structures in ancient history, and the speaker didn't raise or build it himself. So what is he conveying with this phrase? Absolutely. He's saying his people, the African Americans, built these amazing wonders of the world, a great accomplishment. Let's write that down in our note catcher. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Wow, there's a lot here to think about. What are some phrases that stand out to you, and what do you think they mean? Right. You're thinking about how Abe Lincoln ended slavery in the southern states during the Civil War with the phrase, Lincoln went down to New Orleans. Let's write that down. Others of you noted the phrase, singing of the Mississippi. We know rivers don't sing. So what does Hughes mean in this phrase? Good thinking. Sometimes we sing when we're happy. In this line, we were talking about Lincoln and how he ended slavery. So this phrase means it's a joyous time when African Americans were freed from slavery by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Let's put that into a brief phrase in our notes. Did you pull out another phrase? Muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. What is the meaning of this phrase? Yes, muddy is brown, so maybe referring to their skin color or to the darkness of slavery. And then it turns golden in the sunset. Like with the end of slavery, there's hope for more great things. Strong thinking, students. Let's record that idea. Muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Hope for greatness with end of slavery. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. What do you notice about how the poem ends? Yes, it echoes how the poem started. What might the speaker be trying to tell us with that repetition? I agree. Maybe he wants to emphasize the importance of the relationship between African Americans and history, so we don't forget it. Is that structure or language? Right, that's structure. Jot that down. Repetition of I've known rivers and my soul has grown deep like the river at the end conveys importance of relationship between African Americans and history. Now let's consider the last line again. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. We had written this in our organizer under language way back at the beginning of the lesson, but we weren't sure what it meant. Now that we've reread the poem closely, what do you think it means? Good thinking. It could mean a couple of things, right? His soul, or the African American people, have a long history, just like the rivers he mentioned. And it's deep, like he means there's a lot of wisdom in that history, which can help the people continue on even stronger. Let's write that down. We are just about out of time for today. Thank you so much for taking a deep dive into the poem with me. I have one more thing that I'd like to ask you to do today. For independent practice, after this lesson, write a paragraph explaining how Langston Hughes uses structure and language to develop a theme in The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Students, please copy down the independent practice so you have the assignment when the video ends. You have your note catcher, which has your thoughtful ideas and quotes you can use to support your interpretation of the theme. Remember, a theme is the message that the author wants to convey to you, the reader. There are lots of ways to write about a theme you have found in this poem. Just be sure to include evidence from the poem which you have in your notes. Then share your writing with a family member or a friend. I enjoyed working on The Negro Speaks of Rivers with you today. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you on our next lesson here at Tennessee's At Home Learning Series. Bye.